Before the Civil War came to Alabama, there was a plantation where the natural way of human relationships had been ruined beyond recognition. Court papers hidden for 90 years speak of a woman who planned something so very disturbing that 3 different judges refused to allow the testimony to be recorded completely. The few remaining pieces mention unnatural breeding plans, forced marriages between blood relations, and a planned program that broke every moral rule known to civilized society. What made this case especially haunting was not just what happened. It was who planned it and how she convinced a whole community to look the other way for nearly 2 decades. The details that follow come from recently opened statements, plantation books marked with secret codes, and stories so upsetting that the court reporter added a personal note, calling them the darkest secrets I have seen in 30 years of work. Before we go on with the story of Fair Hope Plantation and the woman they called the Mistress of Increase, if you are hearing this from Alabama or anywhere in the Deep South, leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this deserve to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you do not. The truth is always darker than we imagine. What happened at Fair Hope would force us to face just how far human evil could go when power faced no punishment, and when profit mattered more than doing what was right. Fair Hope Plantation sat on 12,200 acres of prime cotton land in Wilcox County, Alabama, where the Alabama River turned through soil so rich it looked black after rain. The plantation had been started in 1003 by Colonel James Sutherland, a Revolutionary War veteran who built his money on cotton and kept a reputation for strict but fair treatment of his workers. By the time of his death in 1839, Fair Hope was one of the most productive farms in the county, with 97 enslaved people working the fields and keeping an operation that made enough wealth to support the colonel's widow in great comfort. That widow was Margaret Sutherland, though everyone in Wilcox County knew her simply as Mistress Margaret. She was 41 years old when her husband died, leaving her total ownership of the plantation and everything on it. She had been born Margaret Elizabeth Hargrave in Charleston, South Carolina, the daughter of a cotton broker who had made and lost 3 different fortunes before drinking himself to death. She had married Colonel Sutherland at 19, moving to Alabama with the eagerness of a woman escaping a past she never talked about. In the 22 years of their marriage, she had given him 5 children, 4 sons, and 1 daughter. The sons were Thomas, aged 20 at the time of their father's death, William, 18, Benjamin, 16, and Robert, 14. The daughter, Catherine, was only 12. Pictures painted in 1038 showed the family in their finest clothes, standing around the colonel with the practiced look of rich Southern families. Margaret sat beside her husband with her hands folded in her lap, her face calm in a look that suggested neither warmth nor coldness, just careful control. What those pictures did not show was the tension that had lived in the Sutherland house for years. Colonel Sutherland had been a strong believer in discipline and proper behavior. He went to church every Sunday, kept strict moral rules for his house, and held strong opinions about the proper running of a plantation. His wife rarely argued with him in public, but household slaves would later speak of arguments behind closed doors, heated talks about money, about management, about the right way to handle what the colonel called plantation discipline. When the colonel died of a sudden fever in March 1839, 139, there was a proper time of mourning. Margaret wore black for the required year. She managed the plantation through a manager, a hard-faced man named Jonas Pritchard, who had worked at Fair Hope for 7 years. For the first 2 years after her husband's death, life at Fair Hope went on much as it had before. Then, in the spring of 141, Mistress Margaret let Jonas Pritchard go. She told the nearby planters that she wanted to manage Fair Hope more directly, that she felt a manager was a cost she did not need when she had 4 strong sons who could help her run the business. This was unusual, but not unheard of. Widows sometimes took more active roles in plantation management. What people noticed, though, was that Thomas, her oldest son, seemed uncomfortable with his mother's growing involvement. He had been getting ready to go to the University of Alabama, but those plans were quietly dropped. He stayed at Fair Hope, where his mother kept him busy with jobs that seemed designed to keep him close to home. Wilcox County in the 140s was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, at least among the white families who controlled the land. Plantations were separated by miles, but connected through a tight web of social duties. Church services, cotton sales, hunting parties, and occasional dances in the county seat of Camden. Gossip traveled these networks with great speed, and by late 1841, people were beginning to talk about changes at Fair Hope. The first whispers were about Mistress Margaret's sons. Thomas had always been quiet, but now he seemed pulled back, rarely appearing at social gatherings. When he did go to church, he sat with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the front, as if forcing himself to focus. William and Benjamin seemed to follow their older brother's lead, developing a guarded look that neighbors found strange. Only young Robert, still a boy of 15, kept something of his earlier energy, though even he had become quieter. The second set of whispers was more disturbing. They were about changes in how Fair Hope managed its enslaved population. In most plantation communities, there was a brutal honesty about the realities of slavery. The buying, selling, and breeding of human beings was discussed with the same casual manner as any other farming matter. But what Margaret was doing seemed different. She had begun tracking the women on her plantation with unusual focus, keeping detailed records of their monthly cycles, their health, and their age. She had separated the youngest and strongest women into a specific area, away from the main slave cabins, and then there was the matter of the bloodlines. On most plantations, the enslaved population included people of different skin tones, some darker, some lighter, showing generations of mixed ancestry in situations that ranged from terrible to merely sad. But at Fair Hope, beginning in 1842, neighbors noticed that the children being born had begun to look remarkably similar to each other and to Mistress Margaret's own sons. Sarah M. Leland, whose plantation touched Fair Hope to the west, mentioned this to her husband after a church service in November 1842. Her husband, Robert M. Leland, told her not to repeat such talk. "What happens at Fair Hope is Margaret's business," he said. "We do not question how our neighbors run their affairs." This was the unspoken rule of plantation society. You did not look too closely at what happened behind your neighbor's gates because you did not want them looking at what happened behind yours. The system of slavery created endless chances for moral compromise, and survival meant accepting certain lies. So, when people noticed the lights, skinned children appearing at Fair Hope with growing frequency, when they saw how Mistress Margaret kept her sons close to home and away from eligible young ladies in the county, when they heard rumors of strange arrangements in the slave quarters, they chose not to see. They chose not to ask questions because asking questions might require answers, and answers might require action, and action might threaten the entire system that kept them comfortable and wealthy. But there were people who could not choose not to see. The enslaved people at Fair Hope lived inside the nightmare that others could ignore. Among them was a woman named Rachel, 23 years old in 1842, who had been born at Fair Hope. Rachel worked in the main house as a house servant, which meant she saw things that field workers did not. She saw how Mistress Margaret watched her sons with a focus that went beyond a mother's love. She saw how the mistress kept books with secret codes, letters, and numbers that seemed to match women in the separated quarters. She saw how young women were called to the main house at night and returned before dawn, sometimes crying, always silent. Rachel could not write, but she had an amazing memory. She remembered faces, dates, and conversations. She remembered which women disappeared into the separated quarters and when. She remembered which of Mistress Margaret's sons went where and when. She stored these memories away like a person building proof for a trial that had not happened yet. A trial she could not imagine ever happening, but building it anyway because the act of remembering was the only form of fighting back available to her. In the summer of 1843, a woman named Dinina was moved into the separated quarters. She was 19, tall and strong from fieldwork with skin the color of polished walnut. The separated quarters housed 8 women by then, ranging in age from 16 to 25. They lived in a single cabin that had been fixed up with new wood and a stone fireplace. Better conditions than the main slave quarters, which made the other enslaved people jealous and fearful in equal measure. Better conditions meant special purposes. Special purposes meant danger. Dinina had been at Fair Hope since she was 7, purchased along with her mother from a failing plantation in Montgomery. Her mother had died of fever in 1840. Dinina had no family left, which made her vulnerable in ways that even other enslaved people recognized. There was no one to protest if something happened to her, no one whose grief might cause problems. When Dinina was moved to the separated quarters, she asked Rachel what it meant. Rachel looked at her with eyes that held both pity and something harder, the kind of knowledge that comes from seeing horror. "It means Mistress got plans for you," Rachel said quietly. They were in the main house kitchen where Rachel was watching over the evening meal preparations. The cook, an older woman named Bess, was working dough for tomorrow's bread with steady movements that suggested she was deliberately not listening. "Do not fight it. Fighting makes it worse. Just remember you are still alive. Remember that every day you wake up, you survived another night. Plans?" Dinina's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of plans?" Rachel looked at Bess, then back to Dinina. The kitchen was hot from the oven fire, and sweat ran down Rachel's face in steady streams. "The kind we do not talk about. The kind that make you wish you had never been born pretty. Just do what she tells you. Keep your head down. Maybe you will survive it." That night, Dinina was called to the main house. Mistress Margaret met her in the sitting room, the room where the Colonel's picture still hung above the fireplace. The mistress was wearing a dark blue dress her hair pulled back tightly, her face calm in that same look of careful control that the artist had captured years before. "Dinina," she said, and her voice was pleasant, almost warm, "I have been watching you. You are strong, healthy, you come from good stock. Your mother was an excellent worker before she got sick. I have plans for you. Plans that will ensure you are well taken care of, better than the field workers. Do you understand?" Dinina kept her eyes down. "Yes, mistress. Look at me." Margaret's voice hardened slightly. When Dinina raised her eyes, she found the mistress studying her with the same focus that a horse breeder might study a promising horse. "You will be given responsibilities, special responsibilities. My son Thomas will explain them to you. You will obey him in all things. You will not discuss these responsibilities with anyone outside the separated quarters. Is that clear?" "Yes, mistress. Good. Thomas is waiting in the library. Go to him now." Dinina went to the library, her heart beating so hard she thought she might faint. Thomas Sutherland was 24 years old that summer, a thin man with his father's height and his mother's careful control. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkening yard, and did not turn when Dinina entered. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low and tight. "Close the door." Dinina closed the door. The library was lined with books that the colonel had collected over the years. Books on farming science, histories of the Revolution, collections of sermons. A lamp burned on the desk, casting shadows that seemed to move in the corners. "My mother has a system," Thomas said, still not looking at Dinina. "She believes in efficiency, in getting the most value. She has decided that the best way to increase the value of our holdings is to improve the bloodlines. Do you understand what that means?" Dinina did not trust her voice, so she just shook her head. Thomas finally turned to face her. His look was difficult to read. Shame and giving up mixed with something that might have been begging. "It means she wants the children born here to be of mixed blood, more mixed than usual. She believes it makes them more valuable, more intelligent, more capable of skilled work." He paused, swallowing hard. "She has decided that my brothers and I will contribute to this program." The full horror of what he was describing settled over Dinina like a heavy cloth. This was not the common tragedy of enslaved women bearing their masters' children. That was horrific enough, but sadly familiar. This was something more planned, more systematic. A breeding program designed and managed by a mother using her own sons as tools. "I am sorry," Thomas whispered, and he sounded like he meant it. But sorry did not change anything. Sorry was just a word that comfortable people used when they participated in horror while wishing they did not have to. "You will stay in this library tonight. In the morning, you will return to the separated quarters. This will happen regularly until you are with child. Then you will be moved to a different cabin where you will be well cared for until the birth. After that," he shrugged helplessly, "after that, my mother will decide." Dinina wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to set the entire plantation on fire and watch it burn. But she was one woman surrounded by armed white men in a county where enslaved people who fought back were tortured and killed as examples. So she did what Rachel had advised. She survived the night. This was the system that Margaret Sutherland had created at Fair Hope Plantation. It was orderly, written down, and hidden in plain sight. The separated quarters held women chosen for their youth and health. Margaret's sons, Thomas, William, and Benjamin, were assigned to different women on a rotating schedule that Margaret tracked in her book with cold precision. The resulting children were raised in a separate nursery. given better food and clothing than other enslaved children, and trained for positions as skilled workers or house servants. To the outside world, Fairhope appeared successful and well managed. Cotton production remained strong. The enslaved population grew steadily, not through purchase, which required money, but through what plantation owners softly called natural increase. When neighboring planters praised Margaret on her management skills, she accepted their praise with polite modesty. What made this system particularly wicked was how it corrupted everyone it touched. The enslaved women who were forced into the separated quarters had no choice and bore the full weight of the trauma, but they also received slightly better treatment than field workers, which created anger and division within the enslaved community. Some women, desperate to escape the brutal work of the cotton fields, actually hoped to be selected, a choice that was not really a choice, just a different form of horror. Margaret's sons were also victims of their mother's system, though their suffering was of a different level. Thomas, the eldest, had essentially given up his own life and future. He never married. He rarely left Fairhope. He performed his assigned role in his mother's breeding program with visible reluctance but complete obedience. William and Benjamin followed their brother's pattern, becoming extensions of their mother's will. Only young Robert, who turned 18 in 1843, fought back. The conflict between Robert and his mother came to a head in January 1844. Robert had been courting Emily Harrison, the daughter of a neighboring planter. The courtship had been going normally: Sunday visits, supervised walks, letters exchanged under proper eyes. Robert seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. Then Margaret called him into her study. "You will end this courtship with the Harrison girl," she told him flatly. "I need you here. Your brothers need your help with our program." Robert stared at his mother with open disgust. "Your program? Is that what you call it, Mother? What you are doing is necessary, profitable, and none of your concern." Margaret's voice was ice. "You are 18 years old, Robert. Everything you have, everything you are comes from this plantation. You will do your duty to this family just as your brothers do." "My brothers are prisoners," Robert said. "You have made them prisoners. You have made all of us prisoners. Even the—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with how to finish the sentence. "Even the women in those quarters. Do you understand what you are doing? Do you even care?" Margaret stood up slowly. She was shorter than her son by several inches, but she had a presence that made her seem larger. "I understand that we are alone in this world, Robert. Your father left us debts that you know nothing about. This plantation was failing. I saved it. I built a system that ensures our survival and our wealth. Do you think the Harrison girl's father would let her marry you if he knew we were on the edge of poverty? Everything I have done for this family, not for me." Robert said quietly, "I will not be part of this. I will not." The argument continued for hours, but Margaret Sutherland had not built her system by accepting defeat. Over the following weeks, she systematically destroyed Robert's courtship with Emily Harrison. She spread subtle gossip about money problems at Fairhope. She had Thomas write to Emily's father, suggesting that Robert was unstable, prone to strange ideas and wrong sympathies. By March, the Harrison family had cooled considerably toward the courtship. By April, it was over. Robert sank into a sadness that worried even his brothers. He spent his days riding across the plantation, avoiding the separated quarters, avoiding the main house, avoiding everyone. At night, he drank in his room, whiskey purchased secretly from Camden and smuggled home in saddlebags. The household slaves whispered that they heard him crying sometimes late at night when he thought no one could hear, but someone did hear. Rachel, working in the main house, keeping her careful mental records, heard Robert's grief and recognized in it a possible friend, not an equal. He was still the master's son, still free, still protected by whiteness and maleness in ways she could never be, but a friend nonetheless. Someone who saw the horror for what it was, someone who suffered from it, even if his suffering was different from hers. So, one night in May 1844, when Robert stumbled into the kitchen looking for food after another day of drinking, Rachel took a calculated risk. She was alone. Bess had gone to bed hours earlier, and the rest of the house was quiet. "Master Robert," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Robert looked at her with blurry eyes. He was 20 years old and looked 40, his face tired from drink and despair. "Tell me what, Rachel, about what your mother is doing, the full truth of it, because I do not think you know everything. I do not think your brothers know everything." She paused, her heart racing. If she was wrong about him, if he reported this conversation to his mother, she would be sold or worse. She is keeping records, detailed records, not just of when things happen, but of the children, who their fathers are. She is planning their futures, planning to keep them enslaved, even though they are your half-siblings, even though they are your blood. Robert sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "I know. God help me. I know, but do you know she is planning to use them too, the girls, when they are old enough? She is already making lists. I seen the book. She plans to have your brothers, or maybe even you, father children with women who are already your daughters." Rachel's voice was shaking now, but she pushed forward. "That is what is coming, Master Robert. That is the future she is building, generations of it. Blood mixing with blood until nobody knows who they are anymore. Until the evil just keeps multiplying." Robert put his head in his hands. "Stop. Please stop. I cannot stop. You can stop her. You are still free. You can still leave here. You can still tell people." "Tell them what?" Robert's voice was full of pain. "Tell them my mother is breeding slaves with her own sons. Tell them I have children in those quarters, children I will never acknowledge, children who will grow up enslaved, who would believe me. And even if they believed me, who would care? You think other plantations are run by saints. You think what happens here is so different from what happens everywhere else. It is the same evil, Rachel, just more organized, more efficient, more honest about what it really is." He was right, and they both knew it. The system of slavery was built on violence and rape. What Margaret Sutherland had created was merely a more systematic version of what happened in pieces across the South. The difference was in the organization, in the careful record-keeping, in the multi-generational planning, but the basic evil was the same. Still, Rachel tried once more, then helped them escape, the women in the separated quarters. "Help them run north. You could. I cannot. Mother watches everything, and even if some of them escaped, she would just select new women. The system would continue. The only way to stop it would be to..." He stopped, looking at Rachel with sudden focus despite the alcohol. "To destroy it completely, to burn fair hope to the ground." They sat in silence after that, two people trapped in different rooms of the same hell, equally powerless despite their vastly different positions. Robert eventually stood and left the kitchen without another word. Rachel waited, shaking for the consequences of her boldness, but none came. Robert never reported their conversation, and life at Fairhope continued its terrible rhythm. By 1845, the system was fully working and growing. The separated quarters now held 12 women. Margaret's book listed 32 children born as part of her program, ranging in age from newborn to 3 years old. The plantation's total enslaved population had grown to 143 people, making Fairhope one of the larger operations in Wilcox County. Production remained strong. Financially, Margaret's system was succeeding exactly as she had planned. But maintaining such a system required constant watchfulness and increasing cruelty. Margaret could not allow disagreement, could not allow communication that might expose her operation, could not allow any of the women in the separated quarters to form bonds that might lead to group resistance. So, she moved them regularly, breaking up friendships. She rewarded obedience with small privileges and punished reluctance with immediate removal of those privileges. She kept them isolated from the wider enslaved community, preventing the formation of any unified response. This isolation was mental as well as physical. The women in the separated quarters were told repeatedly that they were lucky, that they had been chosen for their superior qualities, that the children they bore would have better lives than field slaves, that their suffering served a higher purpose, the improvement of the race, the increase of value, the money success that benefited everyone on the plantation. Margaret sold this story with conviction, and some of the women, desperate for meaning in their trauma, began to believe it, but not all of them. Dinina, now 21 and mother to a 2-year-old boy whose father was Thomas Sutherland, had never accepted Margaret's story. She had learned to act obedient while maintaining a core of resistance in her mind. She was also, though she did not know it yet, pregnant again, this time by William Sutherland following Margaret's rotation system. On a September evening in 1845, when Dinner returned to the separated quarters after another night in the main house, she found Rachel waiting outside the cabin. The two women had developed a careful friendship over the years, communicating in glances and brief exchanges when they crossed paths in the main house or yard. "I am leaving," Rachel said without opening talk, her voice barely above a whisper. "Found a way north, someone who can help. I wanted to tell you before I go." Dinina felt her heart jump, half hope, half terror, when, tomorrow night, new moon, darkness enough to get to the river. Rachel reached out and squeezed Dinina's hand briefly. "I wanted to ask you to come, but you got a child. Makes running harder, and you are pregnant again," Dinina finished. "I know, been sick the past 3 mornings." She felt tears burning her eyes. "Go, Rachel. Run far and fast, and when you get north, if you can tell somebody, tell them what happens here. Tell them everything." Rachel nodded. "I will. I promise you I will." And Dinina, survive. Just survive. Things cannot stay like this forever. World is changing. War might be coming. Just survive until things change. They hugged briefly, two women holding each other in the darkness, and then Rachel disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, Mistress Margaret discovered her most trusted house servant was missing. The reaction was fast and terrible. Margaret sent her sons and 2 hired men into the woods with dogs. They tracked Rachel for 3 days, finally catching her 15 miles north of Fairhope, hidden in a hollow tree near the Tombigbee River. What happened to Rachel after they brought her back? became another one of Fair Hope's silences. The official record showed that she was sold to a trader heading to New Orleans. But enslaved people at Fair Hope whispered darker possibilities, that she had been punished so severely she died, that she had been buried in an unmarked grave in the woods, that Margaret Sutherland had made an example of her that was too terrible to speak about openly. Dinina never learned the truth. She only knew that Rachel was gone and that her promise to tell somebody what happened at Fair Hope had died with her escape attempt. The failed escape had consequences beyond Rachel's fate. Margaret tightened security throughout the plantation. She hired extra managers, men with hard faces and ready whips who patrolled the quarters at night. She started a pass system, making it impossible for enslaved people to move between areas of the plantation without written permission. And she reminded everyone at Fair Hope, in ways both subtle and clear, what happened to people who tried to leave or who helped others leave. The tightened security made life harder for everyone, but barely slowed Margaret's breeding program. If anything, she increased it. By 1846, the separated quarters held 15 women, and Margaret had begun selecting girls as young as 15 for inclusion. The children from her program numbered 47. She was, by any measure of plantation money, succeeding brilliantly. Her wealth grew. Her social position in Wilcox County remained secure, and the system she had created kept running with terrible efficiency. But systems built on violence and secrecy are naturally unstable. They require constant energy to maintain, constant cruelty to enforce, and they create enemies faster than they can hold them down. By 1847, Margaret Sutherland had made enemies of her own sons, of the women she enslaved, and of the growing number of enslaved men at Fair Hope, who watched the separated quarters with helpless rage. She had built something monstrous, and monsters always eat their creators. Eventually, just when we thought we had seen the full reach of Margaret Sutherland's carefully constructed nightmare, the system she created at Fair Hope began revealing even darker layers. If you have made it this far in this story, you understand that some historical horrors deserve to be remembered, not because they are entertaining, but because forgetting them means allowing them to be repeated. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how unchecked power corrupts absolutely. Hit that like button to help more people discover these hidden chapters of history, and subscribe so you never miss the dark truths that normal history books often skip. Because what happened next at Fair Hope Plantation would test the very limits of human strength and expose the certain collapse that comes when evil builds its house on sand. The truth is patient, but it always comes out. In April 1847, a traveling minister arrived in Wilcox County. His name was Reverend Joshua Hayes, a Presbyterian preacher from Connecticut, who had been traveling through the South for 2 years, conducting revivals and preaching the gospel to both white and black groups where allowed. Reverend Hayes was 53 years old, gray, haired and thin, with the kind of intensity in his eyes that comes from genuine religious belief rather than performance. He was also, though he did not say it openly in Alabama, a believer that slavery did not fit with Christian principles. Margaret Sutherland invited Reverend Hayes to conduct services at Fair Hope, as was usual when a respected minister passed through the area. She made the invitation partly from genuine religious practice. She attended church regularly and considered herself a moral woman, and partly from social duty. Refusing to host a traveling minister would have raised questions among her neighbors. Reverend Hayes arrived at Fair Hope on a Sunday morning in late April. He conducted services in the plantation chapel, a simple wooden building that the colonel had built years earlier. The white family sat in the front seats. Behind them, in a balcony built for the purpose, sat the enslaved people of Fair Hope, those who were allowed to attend, which was perhaps half the total population. As Reverend Hayes preached about goodness and judgment, about the accounting that all people would face before God, about how no system built on unfairness could stand forever, he noticed something strange. The woman who owned Fair Hope, Mistress Margaret, listened with a look of calm agreement, but her son sitting beside her looked increasingly uncomfortable, and in the balcony, several young women watched him with looks that seemed to plead for something beyond salvation. They looked haunted in a way that went beyond the normal grief of slavery. They looked like people who had seen horrors that exceeded even the considerable horrors of their situation. After the service, Margaret invited Reverend Hayes to dinner. It was a formal meal served by enslaved people in the dining room where the colonel's picture still watched over the table. The conversation was pleasant and proper. Margaret spoke about her late husband, about the challenges of managing a plantation alone, about her pride in her son's help with the operation. Thomas, William, and Benjamin added little to the conversation, answering direct questions with brief responses and otherwise staying silent. Robert was not there. He had left Fair Hope 3 weeks earlier, according to his mother's explanation, to visit relatives in Mobile. Margaret mentioned this casually, as if his absence was routine and unremarkable. But Reverend Hayes noticed how Thomas jumped slightly when his younger brother was mentioned, and how Margaret's voice hardened almost invisibly when she spoke Robert's name. After dinner, as was custom, Reverend Hayes was offered the opportunity to conduct an informal prayer service for the enslaved people of the plantation. Margaret gave her permission with polite superiority, and one of the enslaved men led the minister to the larger of the slave quarters. Not the separated quarters, Hayes noted, but a different set of cabins closer to the fields. About 40 people gathered as evening settled over the plantation. They sang songs, their voices rising in tunes that carried pain and hope in equal measure. Reverend Hayes preached briefly about staying strong and faith, and then, as he always did, he invited people to speak their troubles aloud if they wished, promising that prayer could ease all burdens. For a long time, no one spoke. Then an older man named Solomon stood up. He was perhaps 60 years old, his hair white, his back bent from decades of field work. Reverend, Solomon said carefully, "What do you say about a place where the sins are so deep that even speaking them aloud feels like more sin, where the evil has gone on so long it has become normal, where people know what is happening but turn away, because looking at it directly would burn their eyes?" Reverend Hayes studied the old man carefully. "I would say that evil grows in silence, Solomon, that bearing witness is sometimes the only resistance available to the powerless, and that God sees everything, even what men try to hide." Solomon nodded slowly, then he sat down without saying anything more, but a young woman in the back, Hayes did not learn her name, stood up next. "Reverend, what happens to the children born from forced unions? Are they blessed or cursed? Are they innocent, or do they carry the sin of how they were made?" Hayes felt the weight of the question, the deep religious and moral difficulty it contained. "Children are always innocent," he said firmly. "Always, whatever circumstances brought them into this world, they bear no guilt for it. God knows each child, knows their suffering, knows their worth." He paused. "But those who force such unions, those who treat human beings as breeding stock, those who ruin the natural bonds between parent and child for profit. They will answer for it. Before men, if possible, before God, certainly. The young woman sat down. No one else spoke after that, but Hayes felt something in the gathering, a tension, a secret, a shared knowledge of something too terrible to speak aloud, even in the relative safety of this informal service. He made a mental note to check further if the chance arose. The opportunity came the next morning. Hayes was preparing to leave Fairhope when Thomas Sutherland approached him near the horse stables. Thomas looked terrible, tired eyes and pale, moving with the careful slowness of someone barely holding themselves together. "Reverend Hayes," Thomas said quietly, looking around to ensure they were alone. "I need to speak with you privately, not here, somewhere away from the plantation. Can you meet me in Camden tomorrow at the courthouse? I will be there at noon." Hayes studied the young man carefully. "Are you in danger, son?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "We are all in danger, Reverend. Some of us just recognize it more clearly than others. Will you meet me?" "I will." Thomas nodded and walked away without another word, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible weight. The next day, Reverend Hayes waited at the Wilcox County Courthouse in Camden. It was a Tuesday, and the courthouse square was busy with people conducting weekly business. Merchants, farmers, lawyers, and enslaved people running errands for their owners. At exactly noon, Thomas Sutherland arrived looking even worse than he had the day before. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said. They walked away from the courthouse to a less crowded area near the river. Thomas kept looking around, nervous and upset. "Reverend, I need to confess something, not to you as a minister exactly, but to you as a witness, someone who might remember and who might someday testify to what I am going to tell you." "I am listening, son," and Thomas told him everything. He described his mother's system in clear detail, the selected women, the breeding program, the careful record-keeping, the children born of planned unions between Margaret's sons and the enslaved women. He explained how it had started small after his father's death and grown into something huge and orderly. He confessed his own part, his shame, his inability to stop it despite his disgust. "My youngest brother, Robert, refused," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "He refused to participate. He tried to leave. Mother would not let him. They argued for months. Finally, 3 weeks ago, he stopped swallowing hard. Robert killed himself, hanged himself in his bedroom. Mother found him. She cut him down and told everyone he had gone to Mobile. We buried him at night in the woods, unmarked grave, like he was something shameful, because to her, his refusal was shameful. His death was proof that he was weak." Reverend Hayes felt sick. "Thomas, you need to go to the authorities. You need to." "Need to what?" Thomas's voice was sharp. "Report my mother for breeding slaves." "That is not illegal, Reverend. It is good business. Report her for forcing her sons to participate. There is no law against that either. She has not broken any laws. She has just taken the existing laws to their logical conclusion. The system protects her. The system is her. Then you need to leave, get away from Fairhope, start a new life somewhere else. I cannot. She controls everything, all the money, all the property. I have nothing except what she gives me. And besides," Thomas looked out at the river, his face twisted with pain. "Besides, those children are my responsibility, my sons and daughters. If I leave, who protects them? Who ensures they are treated well? If I leave them, am I not just adding another sin to all the others?" Reverend Hayes had no answer for that. The moral difficulty was huge. Thomas was both victim and doer, both prisoner and helper, both father and enslaver. He was trapped in a web that his mother had woven using the raw materials of slavery itself, and there was no clean way out. Any path forward involved more sin, more suffering, more impossible choices. "What do you want me to do, Thomas? Remember, just remember, write it down if you can, somewhere safe, because this system, it cannot last forever. Someday, maybe after I am dead, maybe after everyone at Fair Hope is dead, someone will ask what happened here. And I want there to be a record, a witness, someone who knew the truth and wrote it down." Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. "This is my diary from the last 6 years. Everything is in here. Take it, hide it, do not show it to anyone while Mother is alive. She would destroy it and probably hurt whoever has it. But keep it safe for the future, for the accounting that must come eventually." Reverend Hayes took the journal with shaking hands. "Thomas, I will do what you ask, but I am also going to pray for you for a way out, for saving in this life, not just the next." Thomas smiled sadly. "Pray all you want, Reverend, but God seems pretty quiet these days, at least where Fair Hope Plantation is concerned." They parted after that. Reverend Hayes left Wilcox County the next day, carrying Thomas Sutherland's journal hidden in the bottom of his travel bag. He made copies of the most damning entries and put them with trusted colleagues in different cities, creating a distributed record of Fair Hope's secrets. But he did not go to the authorities. What could he report that would matter? What law had been broken that any court in Alabama would prosecute? Thomas was right. Margaret Sutherland had simply perfected the logic of a system that was already legal and widely accepted. Life at Fair Hope continued. The breeding program grew. By 1850, the separated quarters held 18 women. The children from Margaret's program numbered 73. Thomas, William, and Benjamin continued their roles in their mother's system. Their resistance long since crushed into numb obedience. Robert's disappearance was never questioned by neighbors. His supposed life immobile, a fiction that everyone accepted because investigating it would require admitting the possibility of something darker. Denina, now 27, had borne 5 children through Margaret's program, 3 by Thomas, 2 by William. She had learned to survive by separating her mind from her body during the nights in the main house, by focusing on her children during the days, by keeping a core of self that her enslavers could never quite touch despite their violations. She was also, though she did not know it yet, teaching that resistance to her children, showing them through example that survival itself was a form of defiance. But survival alone was not enough. The women in the separated quarters had begun very carefully and very secretly to communicate among themselves despite Margaret's efforts to keep them apart. They developed codes, songs with double meanings, ways of arranging laundry to signal messages, brief exchanges during rare moments of unsupervised contact. They were not planning rebellion exactly. They were too practical for that. But they were building something, a network, a collective memory, a foundation for future resistance if the opportunity ever arose. That opportunity came from an unexpected direction, the growing national crisis over slavery itself. By 1855, the entire South was caught up in increasingly bitter conflicts over slavery's expansion into new territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had turned the territories into battlegrounds. Violence was spreading. Political talk was becoming more extreme on both sides, and some enslaved people paying attention to these developments in the limited ways available to them began to sense that the system might not last forever. That change might be coming at Fair Hope. This growing tension showed in subtle ways. The white men who visited the plantation, merchants, neighboring planters, overseers looking for work, talked more openly about northern aggression, about threats to southern society, about the need to defend their way of life. Margaret Sutherland listened to these conversations with careful attention. She had built her wealth on slavery's foundation. Any threat to that foundation was a threat to everything she had created. But she was also aging. She was 57 years old in 1855, and the years of maintaining her system through force of will had taken their toll. She was still strong, still in complete control of Fair Hope, but she was beginning to think about who would take over. How would her system continue after she died? How could she ensure that her sons maintained it? How could she protect the investment she had made in creating a population of mixed-race children trained for skilled labor? The answer, she decided, was paperwork. She began creating more detailed records, not just the coded books she had always kept, but explicit written instructions for how the breeding program should continue. She wrote out the system's logic, its benefits, its procedures. She explained which women should be paired with which men based on their characteristics and bloodlines. She described her multi-generational plan. The children from the first generation would eventually be paired with each other or with new women brought onto the plantation, creating a self-keeping system that would increase Fair Hope's value forever. Margaret kept these documents in a locked box in her bedroom. She showed them to Thomas, explaining that he would inherit Fair Hope and the responsibility for maintaining her system. Thomas listened with the empty-eyed obedience of someone who had given up fighting years ago. He nodded when she asked if he understood. He promised to continue her work, and he hated himself more completely than he ever had before. But someone else saw those documents. A woman named Hannah, who had been selected for the separated quarters in 1853 at age 16, worked sometimes as a house servant when Margaret needed extra help. On a March day in 1856, while cleaning Margaret's bedroom, Hannah saw the locked box sitting open on the desk. Margaret had stepped out momentarily to speak with a manager. Hannah could not read well, but she could read well enough to understand what she was looking at. Instructions for breeding, plans for generations of enslavement, her own name, and the names of her friends in the separated quarters listed with notes about their characteristics and baby-making potential. Hannah did not take the documents that would have been noticed immediately. Instead, she did something smarter. She remembered. She memorized as much as she could in the brief moments before Margaret returned. And that night, she shared what she had learned with the other women in the separated quarters. The knowledge of Margaret's written plans changed something deep in those women. Before they had known the system existed, but seeing its multi-generational scope written out explicitly, seeing themselves and their children reduced to breeding stock with calculated futures, sharpened their rage in a new way. They began making plans of their own. The plans were simple and practical. They could not escape. Security was too tight, and most of them had children they would not abandon. They could not rebel openly. The consequences would be swift and fatal. But they could resist in small ways. They could slow down production. They could teach their children to read despite the rule against it. They could keep their humanity despite every effort to reduce them to mere reproductive capacity. And they could wait for an opportunity. That opportunity came in 1861 when the war finally started. The attack on Fort Sumter in April sent shock waves through Alabama. Men began joining Confederate forces. The careful social order that had kept plantation society functioning began to fray. And at Fairhope, Margaret Sutherland faced her first serious challenge in 20 years. Her sons wanted to join up. Thomas, William, and Benjamin came to their mother in May 1861 with a unified position. They wanted to fight for the Confederacy. It was, they argued, their duty as Southern men. It was what was expected. Everyone was joining. Staying home would be shameful. Margaret refused. She needed them at Fairhope to maintain the system. The breeding program could not function without them. The war would not last long. Everyone said so, and when it ended, their service to the family would have been more valuable than their service to the Confederacy. The argument that followed was the most serious challenge to Margaret's authority since Robert's rebellion 15 years earlier. This time, though, Thomas had his brother's support. They were done. The war offered an escape, a purpose beyond the nightmare their mother had created. They would join whether she permitted it or not. Faced with this ultimatum, Margaret made a calculation. She could force them to stay, but forced obedience was increasingly difficult to maintain as her sons aged and her own strength faded. Better to let them join with her blessing and maintain some influence over them than to have them leave in rebellion. So she agreed, but with conditions they would return to Fairhope regularly. They would maintain their responsibilities to their children, and they would ensure that the system continued after the war. Thomas, William, and Benjamin agreed to her conditions. In June 1861, all three joined the 10th Alabama Infantry Regiment. They left Fairhope for military service, and for the first time in over 20 years, Margaret Sutherland's system lost its central components. The separated quarters still existed. The women were still there. The children were still being raised according to Margaret's plans. But the men whose participation was essential to the breeding program were gone. Margaret hired managers to maintain discipline and tried to continue the system using other means. But it was not the same. The managers she hired did not have the investment in the program that her sons had. They were brutal and efficient, but they lacked the complex emotional investment that had made her sons such effective tools. The system began to break down, and the women in the separated quarters noticed. They noticed the reduced supervision. They noticed Margaret's increasing frustration and desperation. They noticed the war news filtering through the plantation, battles lost and won, territory changing hands, the possibility of Union forces reaching Alabama. They noticed and they waited. The wait lasted 4 years. 4 years of war, of lacking things, of growing chaos as the Confederacy collapsed. Thomas Sutherland was killed at Chickamauga in September 1863. William was wounded at Missionary Ridge in November and died of infection 3 weeks later. Only Benjamin survived the war, returning to Fairhope in June 1865, thin and traumatized and forever changed by what he had witnessed. When Benjamin came home, he found Fairhope barely recognizable. Margaret was 67 years old and failing. The plantation was in a mess. The war had ended. Slavery had ended. The 13th Amendment had ended the entire system upon which Margaret had built her empire. The women in the separated quarters were free. The children born through Margaret's program were free. Everyone was free, but freedom was complicated. Where would they go? How would they survive? The structure of slavery was gone, but nothing had replaced it. Most of the formerly enslaved people at Fairhope stayed simply because they had nowhere else to go and no resources to leave. Some became sharecroppers, trading one form of exploitation for another, slightly less brutal version. Some left for nearby cities, seeking whatever work they could find. A few headed north, chasing rumors of better opportunities. Denina stayed. She was 42 years old with 5 surviving children ranging in age from 8 to 20. She had no education, no money, no connections beyond Fairhope. She became a sharecropper on land she had once been forced to work as a slave, growing cotton for a share of profits that never quite appeared. But she was free to leave if she wanted. She had her children with her. She could make decisions about her own life, and she could finally speak. She could tell her children who their fathers were. She could explain what had happened in the separated quarters. She could name the system that had created them and the woman who had designed it. Margaret Sutherland died in November 1865, 6 months after the war ended. She never admitted the destruction of her system. She never apologized. She never showed remorse. She died believing she had done what was necessary, that she had been efficient and practical, that history would eventually recognize her genius. She was wrong about that last part. Benjamin inherited Fairhope, but he could not maintain it. The plantation economy had collapsed. He had no money to hire workers and no stomach for the sharecropping system that was replacing slavery. In 1867, he sold Fairhope to a northern buyer for a fraction of its former value. The buyer divided the land and sold pieces to various purchasers, including, surprisingly, several formerly enslaved families who had saved enough to buy small plots. Benjamin moved to New Orleans, where he died of yellow fever in 1869. He never married. He never spoke publicly about what had happened at Fairhope. The shame consumed him as thoroughly as it had consumed Robert years earlier, just more slowly. The story might have ended there, buried with the people who lived it, except for 3 things. First, Thomas Sutherland's diary still existed. Reverend Joshua Hayes had kept it safe as promised. After his death in 1871, his papers were donated to a Presbyterian school library where they sat largely unexamined for decades. Second, the formerly enslaved people who had lived through Margaret's system remembered. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. The stories were passed down through families as warnings, as evidence of what humans could do to each other, as testimony that needed preserving, even when official records remained silent. Third, some of Margaret's own records survived. When Fairhope was sold, boxes of documents were stored in a Camden warehouse. They sat there, forgotten, through rebuilding, through the Gilded Age, through the early 20th century. Then, in 1935, during the Great Depression, the warehouse was being cleared for destruction. A worker found the boxes and, recognizing their potential historical value, donated them to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Among those documents were Margaret Sutherland's books, her coded entries about the separated quarters, her instructions for maintaining the breeding program, her multi-generational plans for creating a self-keeping system of controlled reproduction. Everything Thomas had described to Reverend Hayes was there in Margaret's own handwriting, documented with the same careful efficiency she had applied to everything. But what made these records particularly chilling was their cold distance. The way Margaret had reduced human beings to breeding pairs, assigned number values to children based on their parents, and projected profits across generations as if she were planning crop rotations rather than engineering the systematic violation of dozens of women. When researchers discovered these documents in 1937, they immediately recognized their importance. Here was explicit evidence of something that historians had long suspected, but rarely found documented so thoroughly. The systematic breeding of enslaved people, organized and managed with the same attention to detail that might be applied to livestock. What made Margaret's records unique was their scale, their multi-generational planning, and the horrifying involvement of her own sons. The documents also revealed something researchers had not expected. Notes in the margins, written in what appeared to be Thomas's handwriting, expressing pain and self-hate. Brief phrases like, "God forgive me and I am damned," appeared beside his mother's cold calculations, creating a heartbreaking contrast to her orderly evil. The archives initially restricted access to the documents, considering them too disturbing for general research. 3 separate review committees examined the materials and debated whether they should be kept at all or destroyed to protect the dignity of the descendants of those who had suffered at Fair Hope. The debates were intense and emotional. Some argued that destruction would add to the crime by erasing evidence of what had happened. Others worried that preservation would dramatize trauma and reduce real people's suffering to academic curiosities. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The documents would be kept but sealed, accessible only to serious researchers who could show legitimate scholarly purpose, and who agreed to treat the materials with appropriate seriousness. They remained sealed until 1947, when a graduate student named Eleanor Washington, herself a descendant of enslaved people from Alabama, asked for access. She argued that understanding such horrors was essential to facing American history honestly, and that the voices of the victims preserved in statements and testimony that had been included in the archive boxes deserved to be heard. Her request was initially denied, then granted after she enlisted support from civil rights organizations and prominent historians who argued that historical truth, however painful, must take place over comfortable silence. When Eleanor finally accessed the documents, she spent 3 months reading every page, often breaking down in tears, as she read the testimony of women like Rachel and Dinina, whose words had been recorded during brief legal proceedings in the 1860s, when some of the formerly enslaved people at Fair Hope had attempted to claim money for their suffering. Eleanor's paper, completed in 1951, was the first comprehensive academic examination of what had happened at Fair Hope Plantation. She titled it The Arithmetic of Evil, Systematic Breeding, and the Ruin of Family at an Alabama Plantation, 1839-1865. The paper was controversial, with some scholars questioning whether such explicit examination of sexual violence was appropriate for academic talk. But Eleanor persisted, arguing that cleaning up history to make it pleasant was itself a form of violence against those who had suffered. Her work slowly entered the historical record, cited by other researchers studying the full scope of slavery's horrors, and gradually the story of Fair Hope Plantation became known beyond the sealed archives where it had been hidden for so long. This mystery shows us something deeply disturbing about human nature, how easily we can construct elaborate excuses for evil when that evil serves our interests. Margaret Sutherland believed she was being practical, efficient, new, taking the logic of slavery to its natural conclusion and maximizing her returns. She never saw herself as a monster, just as a widow doing what was necessary to survive in a difficult world. But the system she created was monstrous precisely because it was so orderly, so planned, so thoroughly integrated into the legal and social structures of her time. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Sutherland saw herself as a monster, or did she genuinely believe she was just being practical? How do we deal with historical horrors that were legal in their time, but wrong by any moral rule? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story affected you, share it with someone who needs to understand that the full truth of slavery was often worse than we imagine. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Stories that challenge us to face the darkest chapters of American history, because remembering is the first step toward ensuring such horrors are never repeated. Thank you for listening.